Once upon a time there was a king of the north, and he was very mighty. His palace was made of marble, metal, and wood, but most of all wood, of which he was very fond. He had many royal carpenters and woodworkers whom he kept close at hand. The king of the north lived with his wife and queen. The queen was often seen in a robe of iridescent quality, reflecting blue, green, teal, and violet. When she danced, it was like moonlight through stained glass. Now there are many things we can say of this king, many unkind things that would be fair when you hear this story. But we cannot say that he didn't love his queen, for he did love his queen, and she him. Now between them they had many servants, and a vast fleet of ships at their command, made only of the finest timbers of the northern wood, and a huge hoard of treasure, which the king guarded jealously. He had wealth, power, and fame throughout the world, more than anybody could imagine. And now, this king and queen were soon to be parents. It was only weeks until Christmas, and the queen's belly had grown large as a sail in the wind. The baby would come at any moment. "I do hope he comes out right on Christmas morning," the king would say, drawing circles around his wife's belly with his mighty hand. He was very proud to have a Christmas baby, and not just any Christmas baby, of course, but an heir to his entire northern kingdom. They invited the other rich kings, queens, monarchs, and dignitaries of the world to visit them for a baby shower. The biggest, mightiest ships would sail in, carrying exotic spices and treasures, all for the infant. Never mind that the infant wouldn't have the faintest idea what to do with them. The king seldom let anybody else visit, and when they did, it was only if the visitors had mighty gifts to give, which would be thrown on top of his already enormous pile of goods. And when the lowly, the poor, and the sick would knock at his door, a servant would open up and callously say, "Go away! The king is trying to spend time with his family. Can't you see it's Christmas?" As the day approached, the anticipation grew and grew. The king commanded his carpenters to build a nursery, a mighty nursery fit only for the offspring of the mighty king of the north. This was so that the queen would have a place to rest while the king caroused with his guests into the wee hours of the morning. He wanted the best trees in the world to be hewn down for this nursery, which meant the trees in the valley of the north wind, the very seat of the North Pole. His carpenters warned him against it. This was the one forest no one on earth, not even the king of the north, may cut down. They implored, they begged him not to do it. Some even outright refused, and the ones who did he sent straight to the stocks, stark naked in the snow. They begged and they begged until he rose from his mighty throne and said, "Enough! Is there a tree on earth that is too noble for my child?" To which one carpenter said, "It is not the trees that we fear, my lord, but the northern wind." The king's face turned cold and hard like a grim monument. Shall man bow to the winds? Or does he make them his subject as well? Does he not yoke the wind to move these mighty timbers across the sea? Thus are both the forest and the wind made the humble servants of man. So spake the king, and nobody dared dispute this point. "And furthermore," he added, "this must be completed by Christmas Eve, for my child shall be born on Christmas morning." The carpenters just exchanged glances and bowed before their sovereign. So his carpenters and woodsmen went into the forest in the valley and began cutting down the trees to build the mighty nursery for the king's child. It took 2 weeks to complete it, running on the schedule that the king set for them. And by Christmas Eve, there was a great wooden hall erected on the ridge overlooking the valley. Down below there was a wide open clearing where the trees had been, now nothing but dwarfish stumps. Right on cue, the queen felt the baby coming, so the king rushed her to the nursery on a mighty horse-drawn sleigh. On the entire ride to the nursery, which was a league from the palace, the baby was trying to get out, but the king commanded that she keep him in until morning. Well, of course, the queen would have none of this. She nearly hurled him off the sleigh at this remark, had the midwife not been there to pacify her and talk some sense into the king. When they reached the nursery, the midwife suggested it was best that the king go back to the palace and return in the morning, which he agreed to without a second's hesitation. That night, Christmas Eve, he slept not a wink, but celebrated with his aristocratic guests in the hall. They feasted on meats, wine, and nog, singing merry songs and dancing on the table. At length the king left his guests and stepped outside to see the nursery. Truth be told, he was very anxious about the whole business, and wanted to see his wife with a child in her arms. The light of a fire, a mere pinprick of light, flickered through the windows of the mighty nursery a league away. He smiled, an oafish, drunken smile, but genuine no less, before going back in and joining the throng. And then midnight struck. At once, all the fires burning in the hall went out, plunging them into darkness. A great shrieking noise rattled the windows throughout the palace like a howling banshee. The other kings and queens yelped and hid under the tables. "The second coming! The second coming!" they shouted. The front door burst open, and a fierce, icy gale blasted through, turning their wine and nog to frost in their hands. The king, all warm from his drink and not fearing the cold, staggered out through the open door, which had come off its hinges. He looked to the valley and saw no light coming from the mighty nursery any longer. He hitched his mightiest horses to his mightiest sled and sped thither with all his might. It swerved and zigzagged often, but he did his best to navigate through the snow and the pines, and finally, before dawn, he reached the nursery up atop the ridge. His feet were blue from wearing only slippers, and a small icicle had grown on the tip of his nose. When he came to the front entrance, he saw the same thing as had happened in his palace. The door was wrenched open, barely hanging on its hinges, and inside was darkness, but for the Arctic moon spying through the windows. In the middle sat an empty crib, and beside it the midwife lay unconscious on the ground. The queen sat in the rocking chair, weeping. She clutched her now flat belly, empty, drooping like a sail with all the wind sucked out. The king's eyes grew wide to take in what the dark and the drink had hidden from him. He approached her cautiously and touched her belly. "Where is my child?" he asked, his voice trembling. The queen continued to weep. "Where is my child?" he bellowed. This cry was answered with an even louder one. It was a deep, deep, deep voice, like something submerged at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, with no warmth or light in it. Within it, the king could hear high tones whistling like a storm. It chilled the king's bones until he felt like they would shatter like glass. He turned around to see the source of this voice, and it was the very doorway itself. "I am the northern wind, and you have sinned against me." The king dashed to the door and tried to pull it closed, but the wind knocked him on his back. "I am the northern wind, and you will not shut me up and keep me out." The wind had fashioned a mouth for itself out of this nursery door. The whistles blew in through the windows till the entire house was but the very jaws of the wind itself. "I have taken your child," said the wind. "I have taken it and hidden it among the children of the world, so you will never find it." "And what is my crime, you devil of the north?" the king shouted. "Your arrogance, among others. You turned away the lowly, the sick, and the weary, and you have hewn down the trees in my valley when you knew it was forbidden. You have taken my children, so I have robbed you of yours." "But my wife," said the king, "what did she ever do to you?" "Nothing," answered the wind. "And now she too suffers for your arrogance. Think on that." With that, the wind sucked itself out from every crack and slammed the door behind it, leaving the king on his back and the queen sobbing by the crib. The dawn had come, and it was Christmas Day. The king and queen rode back all day. The queen was barely alive now, but the king burned deep down inside, and every breath further steeled his will. He would not rest until he retrieved his child, even if it meant knocking on every door, going into every house, turning it upside down and shaking it if he had to. He sent envoys to every country and threatened open war to anybody who refused to give up his baby. The mighty king of the north would not be denied his child. But a year passed, and every envoy returned with nothing. No news. Most of them did not even set sail because the north wind refused to move them. The ones who traveled on foot either lost their bearing in fierce storms or were eaten up by bears. The ones that did make it through found nothing. No other ruler of any other country said they had the king's child. Some welcomed an inspection, but most of them just laughed and shut the door on them. The king's wrath would not be so easily sated, however. He gathered his mighty fleet together to war against the other nations, north wind or no north wind. He hewed down another quarter of the valley forest for new oars that could thrust the ships through any windless sea. But the north wind rose up in anger and stirred the sea to such a fury that almost the entire fleet was dashed to pieces and swallowed up in a mighty maelstrom. Meanwhile, the queen said not a word, and would only eat when the servants forced her to. She wouldn't even bake, nor tell her cooks what her recipes were, so the meals were never quite as exquisite as when she made them. And she never danced, nor even wore her splendid robe, so none ever saw her robe shimmer like moonlight through stained glass. Near the end of the year, the king decided to end this war in one fell swoop. He ordered all of the trees in the valley to be cut down and burned in a large pyre for this child, so the smoke could rise high into the sky and choke the northern wind. On Christmas Eve, his men went down into the valley, and one by one the treetops plummeted to the ground, and they dragged each one through the snow into a mighty infernal heap right in the middle. The flames rose higher and higher, and the smoke grew thicker. The king stood on a ridge and looked down, and then looked over to the nursery to see if his wife was watching. The pyre raged for hours. And then midnight struck. The giant inferno vanished right before the men's eyes, like a candle snuffed out in a careless breath. Another blast of wind came through the valley and blew his men away clean off the face of the earth. At once the king thought of his wife. He sped down into the valley on his sleigh and up again, urging the horses along a steep, steep road. He reached the nursery and saw the same sight as he did 1 year ago. Only this time, the house was empty, completely empty. This he did not expect. "Where is my wife?" "It was I," came that same fell voice. "I took your wife." "So this was for burning your trees down," said the king. "This, no. This was for your neglect. You were so bent on revenge that you neglected the dearest person in the world to you. She prayed. She asked to be taken away from this place. She begged me. And I listened. And so you are not worthy of her any longer." The king dropped to his knees, and his anger vanished in an instant. "Please, take my palace, my horses, my kingdom. I love none of them as much as I love her." "If this were so," said the wind, "you would have comforted her for the loss of her child, and not let her waste away here in the nursery while you made war. But you could not let go of your pride." The king began to sob and whimper. "Very well. You are the true king of the north. You have won, and I am nothing. Is this what you wanted? Please, please let me see my wife." "I have lost as much as you," said the wind. "The valley is empty now, a graveyard of my children, and I will blow a dirge for them day and night here. It is too late for you. She is in a far better place." The wind ceased and moved down into the valley to mourn the trees. The king wept until dawn. When the sun came up, he went down into the valley and walked to the pyre, now a mighty smoldering pile of black, charred trees. He felt very weak at the sight of this. His eyes were now open to what he had done to this place. He reached down into the rubble and pulled out a stick, one that the flames had not licked but rather lay buried in the snow. He used this as a walking stick and made his way back to his palace on foot. The palace was empty. All of the servants had either been blown away or fled or left for new jobs with better pay. The king sat on his bed and held up the stick and slowly took off the charred bark to reveal its bright, smooth insides. He got an idea to take a knife to it. He whittled away at the stick until it would resemble something. This helped to take his mind off of his grief, at least for a little while. And after all, it was his favorite pastime once upon a time, though he had not made anything since he was a child. The hours passed, until finally, at the top of the stick emerged a figurine, a little wooden queen just for him. This pleased him. He continued to carve away at the stick. He carved elaborate patterns down its length, pictures of trees, of snow, and horses, until it was no longer a stick, but a scepter, and no longer a scepter, but a whole world in miniature. The designs were crude and clumsy, but the king didn't mind. It was his world, with the queen at the top. His heart was broken, but this gave him some tiny consolation. That night, he took the staff to the valley and repented before the nursery. "Here is a humble gift for my wife, O northern wind," he said. The wind said nothing. All was still that night. The king laid it down on the steps before the door and returned to his palace. The next day he went into the valley and picked up a larger branch and pulled it back with his sleigh. He broke it into pieces and carved little figurines out of it. He made horses, birds, and flutes, each one more and more refined as he went on. He took these to the nursery and offered them again. "These are gifts for my child. Please take them. Take them to wherever my child is." Again he laid them down on the steps before the door and again returned to his palace. The next day the king went down into the valley once more and took an even larger branch and made larger things out of it, ships, dragons, and trees even. He took these once again to the nursery, and when he got there he was shocked to see that the gifts from the previous nights were gone. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but it looked as though the wind had perhaps taken them. The king got to his knees and prayed, "Please, northern wind, let me see my wife again, and my child for the first time." The wind said nothing. The king's hopes sank as other possibilities crept into his mind. A raccoon or a bear might have picked them up and give them to their queens and children for Christmas. Or the wind may have just blown them away and buried them in the snow out of spite. The king returned to the palace again. His hope had not died completely, though. Just because the wind did not answer his prayer, it did not mean that the wind didn't take the gifts to the king's beloved. The king gathered all of the pieces of wood from the valley that were not completely burned in the fire and took them to his palace. He made most of the same things as he had done before, but he was perfecting his technique as he went on. He became more and more meticulous and less satisfied with each offering, knowing he could do better, knowing his wife and child deserved better. When he ran out of wood, he took apart the remaining ships in his fleet and dragged the timbers to his palace. Soon the wood would turn into hobby horses, soldiers, tortoises, and then, after that, he made cabinets, chairs, a doll's house, and a puppet theater. This gave him the idea to even take the fabrics from his wife's old clothes, from the linen closets, and even his own, to make these little puppets, dolls, hats, and masks. When he ran out, he made a crude spinning wheel and learned to weave his own fabrics. He imagined all of the different things a child could want, and then proceeded to make them. Years went by, and his gifts became finer and finer, and on each Christmas Eve he traveled to the nursery with his stock of gifts, and when he returned in the morning, they would be gone, and every year he would pray to see his wife and child again, and every year the wind would say nothing. The king grew old. Every year his face would grow another wrinkle, like the rings in a tree. With every year his beard thickened and turned gray and then white. But he was strong still, hauling the timbers, traveling greater and greater lengths to fashion his toys. Soon his supply was greater than his ability to carry it on Christmas Eve, so he would only take portions each year. He could not let it grow too high, though, for he could not stand to see them for long, gathering dust, reminding him of his loneliness. But he would not stop either. Soon he ran out of ships, so he started taking apart his palace, brick by brick, piece by piece. The metals he reforged, all of the mighty apparel for war that stood idle in his armory, he took and melted down into tin soldiers with little muskets, trumpets, and horns. the marble he made naturally into marbles. The wood, of course, he continued to use with great reverence. He took everything apart plank by plank and moved right into the nursery, converting it into a workshop. He went on this way each year, working day after day until Christmas, and offering up whatever he had until he had nothing left but his shop and his creations. This could have been a lovely souvenir shop for anybody visiting the kingdom, only nobody did. All the other kings and queens and dignitaries of the world never heard from the king again, and some even said, "Good riddance to bad royalty." The people of the world heard about the king burning down the forests of the Valley of the North, so every Christmas they erected a pine tree in their homes to commemorate these mighty trees now gone from this world. In time, the north wind eventually stopped taking the king's gifts. The king was down to his crown because there was nothing left to use. One year, on Christmas Eve, he removed it from his head and officially renounced his kingship. North Wind, you are the true ruler of the North. I am a humble man. I just never knew it until now. He stood on top of the workshop and offered it up to the wind. He stood up there waiting for 1 whole hour. The wind finally came and blew by and knocked it out of his hands. The crown went tumbling off the roof and down a slope leading out of the valley and into the wide, wide world. The crownless old man yelped. He climbed down as fast as his bones could move him and pursued the crown, which was still rolling along. He followed the crown into a forest, nothing as great as the goodly valley pines, but a forest nonetheless. The crown stopped every now and then, getting caught in a bush or a hollow or under a fallen tree, and then it would continue to tumble down. But every time the old man saw its glint in the dim light and reached for it, something kept it from him. First, the man upset the snow sitting above on the tree branches, and it fell on top of him. By the time he could climb out of it, the crown was in the clutches of a white fox. He tracked it to a frozen waterfall, at the bottom of which a frozen brook had run. The crown slipped from the fox's teeth, rolled out onto the stream, and went its way, slipping and tumbling down the slope. And the man went slipping and tumbling after it, with much pain and discomfort. The man crashed into a snowbank, face first. When he came to, he saw the stream had led to a clearing overlooking the wood. Here the man could look out and spy the land before him. Little lights shone here and there along the hills lining the countryside miles away, even now in the deep of night. Smoke rose from them like chimney tops. He had never seen these before, not in his entire life and career as the king. The only world he had ever really known lay within the walls of his own kingdom. He wanted to see these lights on the hillsides up close, perhaps meet the ones who kept them. They must be villages, he thought, or towns. The only fire of his was that of his lonely forge, his only company the wooden figurines and dolls he had crafted. He imagined the people gathered around these lights, singing, telling stories from days past, conjuring visions for the future, holding each other close. He watched the little columns of smoke spiral up into the sky, which by now was decked with stars. They were clear and bright in the crisp, cold air. He had never seen them so clearly before, thousands of them. Everywhere he looked, there they were, glittering in an ocean on high, and he had never felt as unmighty as he did at that moment. They shone especially bright over the lights below, as if mimicking their terrestrial counterparts. The fox returned and carried away the crown while the man looked on, struck dumb. He never saw the crown again. The forest was very, very, very still. And then midnight struck. A tiny, slight breeze danced through and whispered in the man's ear in the tiniest, slightest voice. He gasped and nearly fell off the edge. There is one way. Before the man knew it, he was swept off his feet and rolled through the air back to his workshop. "Gather your things," said the wind, as the man struggled to gather his wits. But before there was any chance of that happening, from the other side of the valley came. He couldn't believe his eyes. There came a ship, speeding through the air toward him. Where it came from he did not know, for it was not one of his own. It had a hull of white timbers and silver sails that surged with the north wind's breath. It was a magnificent sight not of this world, and it docked right in front of the nursery, still in the air. A causeway lowered itself from the deck, while the man brought all of the gifts on board at the wind's urging. Once he was on with all of the gifts he had crafted over all the years, the vessel rose and rolled through the cloudless sky. "O northern wind, where is this ship taking me?" "To find your child," said the wind, "you must follow the map your wife has laid out for you." "What map?" said he. "My wife never laid out a—" Before he could finish, something caught his eye. Among the multitude of stars, there was one that burned a little brighter on the nearer end of heaven. And from that star, from that point in heaven, there glinted, in and out of the velvety dark, a pale light across the sky, like a ribbon of taffeta, of green and blue and teal and violet, iridescent, shimmering, glowing like moonlight through stained glass, but far more wondrous. Surely this was his wife, pointing the way, showing him that she was still with him. Within minutes, they were hanging, suspended in the air over the village. The old man lowered a rope ladder with a sack over his shoulder, ready to adorn this one and only child. When he landed, he peered inside the nearest window of the nearest house, and on the first try the old man saw a child sleeping, a little boy. But before he could act, there were things the man had to consider. How would he know that this was his child when he saw it? He had no idea how many children there were in the world, but he assumed there was a lot. But how could he possibly find his among all of them? The wind said nothing of how, so the man chose to trust that map in the sky, trust his wife. This boy lay in bed, shivering without a blanket. So naturally the man took out the most beautiful, and more importantly, the warmest quilt he had. This one he didn't make. Only his wife could have made one this beautiful. It was thick and soft, and it was made for this child. How could it not be? The window was open. Well, in fact, it had no latch at all to keep it shut. So he snuck the blanket in, draped it over the boy, and tucked him in. As soon as he finished this, a star above him burned a little brighter for a moment. Was this boy, in fact, his child? He examined the child's features, searching for something familiar, some resemblance. Yet, somehow it didn't matter. In a way that he could not explain at that very moment, it was his child. And then, as the man looked up into the sky, that star above dimmed, and one beside it lit up. The wind came down from the ship and nudged the man to move on. The next star hung over the house of a little girl, 9 or 10 perhaps, who could have very well been his child in the peace of that night. He gave her the first doll he labored over for hours to perfection, laying it beside her in bed. He was extremely pleased at the thought of her discovering it tomorrow. He slipped away as quietly as he could and made for the next house. He was starting to enjoy himself. Again, the star above burned brighter before taking its place among the rest, making way for the next one. For every child in that village there was a star, and when the village was taken care of, a star would burn somewhere else, far away in the firmament. The man climbed back into the ship, his sack empty and ready for the next port. He went on for what seemed like years, yet nighttime remained, as far as the man could tell. The moon itself stood still, while the stars waited patiently above each household, whether it housed rich or poor, large family or small. This was incomprehensible to the man, but he simply took advantage of it rather than question it. The ship swept across the sky, born of the northern wind, and that ribbon of light followed him wherever he went. Every time a star lit up, it reminded him more and more of the light in the nursery, the one he saw when he looked out so many years ago on the eve of his child's birth. Every gift he offered, every child's face he saw got him closer and closer to his own. In fact, he did not return to his workshop until every child on earth was accounted for. And every child was accounted for. And only then did the moon pass along and make for the morning. He sat down in his wife's rocking chair and put his head in his hands and wept and wept. He did not find what he was looking for. In fact, he found something quite different. There were some things even the north wind could not change, but at the very least that night the north wind took mercy on the man and did what it could. It had entreated the help of the other winds and allowed the man to be with his wife and child every Christmas Eve. But only on Christmas Eve could he do this. Any other time was forbidden. This was all the wind could do. But rather than complain, the old man accepted the wind's offer, whatever chance he had to have his wish fulfilled. But every child he saw was a gift in itself. This may sound to many of us like a terrible fate, but Christmas Eve was no punishment to him. On the contrary, it was his night, when the winds held the sky still, and the lone old man sailed from star to star, shining above him, to rain gifts on the children of the world. It no longer mattered which one was his. They were all his children. The next year he would do the same thing. The year leading up to it would be spent in seemingly endless toil. The perpetual labor would be eternal torment to anybody else. But no Sisyphus was he. Everything he made of his own hands was born of love. And so he would continue to find joy in his work, a joy he had never known in his idleness as king. The north wind would never howl in the valley again. Instead, the valley would heal and trees would grow again because of the kindness that the wind and the man had shown to each other. The wind would even rear up a grove of magic firs that grew to full height just so they might lay low their necks in sacrifice to the man's axe. But the man would not take any more than he needed. The wind would labor with him in the valley, and every year he would be guided by his queen, who, some say, is the northern lights dancing in the sky at night. And every year he would greet his child in each child he visited, offering his humble gifts. The man would grow rich again, But it was a special kind of richness, the one that comes from inside, starting in the heart and reaching all the way to the highest hairs on your head and down to the soles of your feet. I'm sure you know what I mean. The old man started his work over again the next day. There was much work to be done until the next Christmas, and he would only stop when his heart was absolutely empty. Yet the funny thing was, it just kept filling up again.